All right, the participants look like it's stabilized a little bit. So welcome. Thank you all for attending. This is session 5A, this is Data Services at the RDAP Summit of 2023. Just a few notes before we get started. This is a Zoom webinar, so attendees are muted and your cameras are turned off. If you'd like to ask a question, you can put your questions in the Q&A of the Zoom session here at the bottom of your screen. This session is going to run from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern, and we're going to leave the last 15 minutes-ish for Q&A. So we'll gather all the questions and address them at the end. This session is going to include 2 presentations, followed by 2 pre-recorded lightning talks. You'll be able to ask questions of the presenters, even the lightning talks, they're here, and we'll be able to respond to questions as they come up, but we'll do that at the end. So because we're doing that all at the end, it's a good idea to indicate which presenter or which presentation you'd like to address your question towards. And if you want to continue the conversation beyond 4 o'clock, you can always keep the conversation going. We encourage that in the chat in Whova, on the Whova platform. Just a word about our code of conduct. The Research Data Access and Preservation RDAP Summit organizers are committed to providing an environment where all attendees can participate fully in the program and activities without fear of harassment or discriminatory behavior of any kind. There is a code of conduct helper available during the session. That's Tisha. And Tisha's labeled on here as code of conduct helper. You can direct any messages to them in Whova if you need assistance. They can also get you the code of conduct email address or the link to the incident report form if needed. All right, so our first presentation today is balancing patron privacy, funding compliance, and open access and data management consultations. Our presenters are going to be Elle Weinholz from UCLA and Steph Crowell of Utah State University. Take it away.
Oh, hi, my name's Elle. This presentation incorporates information around when I was the research data librarian at Utah State University. Steph Crowell is one of our instruction librarians at Utah State University, and Michael Shelton, who is also at Utah State University. I and Mike have since left USU, but all of this presentation really goes on around our work there. And so, you know, this being an RDAP presentation, I think folks are pretty familiar with the idea of research data management and research data services, particularly in colleges and universities. Over the last 20 years, those services have developed pretty extensively. And there's a really rich ecosystem of data services, whether you're talking about Figshare or Dryad or disciplinary specific repositories like HydroShare and data services like DataCite. And one of the large emphasis in these services has been around accessible, findable, interoperable, and reusable data. And so there's this really strong emphasis on sharing. And that's been part of funder requirements. It's been part of open science, you know, reproducibility. And so they extend beyond just the provision of persistent storage, but also other services like instruction around how to do research data management, outreach, data management plans, minting DOIs. These are all things that are part of data services at many universities and colleges. And so through this period, there have been a lot of scholars who have been arguing that libraries are becoming a partner in the research process. And in becoming a partner in the research process, we really need to think about the roles and responsibilities that each participant, including the library, will play in the process. And so one of the things that we observed while providing research data services at Utah State University. And in my background when I was doing my dissertation work at UCLA is that researchers and librarians, they tend to overlook issues of patron privacy and issues of confidentiality because of all of the work that we've done around data sharing and openness, which isn't to, say that that work around data sharing and openness isn't important. It's just that when you look at the literature, it tends to not talk about patron privacy and confidentiality in relation to research data management. It's just this kind of area where there hasn't been very much and hate crimes and attacks on particular research topics, like animal research has always been one of those areas where there have been a lot of intellectual freedom attacks on it. But there have been another current example is around critical race studies. That one's very hotly contested in a lot of areas. And so observations from our work at Utah State University, which is a land grant, it's a relatively large university. It's primarily oriented around undergraduate education, but it has a very large research footprint as well. And so the first, when we were going and looking at these issues, is that if you look at confidentiality in the disciplines, there's a strong expectation of confidentiality across virtually all disciplines. And that shows up in funding application language. It shows up in conference proposal. It just across the board, there's a strong expectation of confidentiality for research proposals, for publications and process for that intellectual property of the researcher. And librarians not working as strongly in this discipline tend to not be as aware of this expectation. But it's a very broad and very strong expectation. And so if we move into that role of being a partner in the research process, we need to be aware of this expectation that's going on. And so because it's a basis for a lot of trust. And so many of my coworkers didn't realize that if I was providing a consultation on a data management plan, that data management was part of a grant application, and those materials, the researcher had a very strong expectation for us to handle them confidentially. And so similarly, our researchers were not aware of our librarian backgrounds on patron privacy. And so the ALA, which tends to be very engaged with public libraries, and the college and research libraries tend to have their own organizations. And so, but there are these very strong stances on patron privacy, and it's foundational to the Library Bill of Rights and a lot of the way the ALA orients around patron services. So if you're looking at developing best practices, what we felt was really needed and hasn't been very well developed in the literature are practices to protect researcher confidentiality and trust, practices to set an expectation of consent, practices to support data security by design, practices to support awareness and educational activities, practices to prepare for challenges to intellectual freedom, and practices that align with patron privacy norms, and not just for the ALA, also for like IFLA and many of the other library professional organizations. And so suggestions that we had for how this could be implemented are communicating with patrons around how personally identifiable information may be used during the course of consultations, document the life cycle of records created over the course of an interaction, ensure that personally identifiable information is only disclosed as necessary to fulfill legal obligations or necessary for the completion of service, and regularly audit, revise, and improve library workflows to ensure that they are protecting patron privacy. And so I hope when I was introducing this that I was clear that what we were talking about was doing consultations around research data management at Utah State University, and that we interact with a wide variety of researchers in terms of faculty, postdocs, graduate students, undergraduates. And so suggestions that we had for how to actually implement that is writing public-facing accessible privacy and confidentiality policies that can be distributed to patrons during the consultation process. That was not something that our institution has, nor was it something that we've seen from most institutions. Implementing an opt-in model of consent for the researcher to control what information is shared and with whom during the consultation process. Because when working on, like, say, a data management plan, for example, we would need to discuss with the researcher the details of their research in order to give them feedback on the data management plan. And so we needed to have their trust that we would be able to manage what information they shared with us with that confidentiality, and have their confidence so that they could share with us enough about what was going on with the research that we could provide a useful consultation on their data management plans. And also, being a public land grant institution, also providing information to the researchers on what kinds of public access obligations might be present, whether from their grant institution or the fact that they're part of a state institution, and be able to make recommendations on how to manage that information so that it will attain their goals and, take care of data security and things like that. And also provide education opportunities for researchers and librarians on best practice management and other concepts as needed, basically to do that outreach to make folks aware of how to best manage their data and be aware of patron privacy and confidentiality issues. So in conclusion, when interacting with our colleagues, when interacting with researchers, when interacting with the literature, we found very little to no discussion of the role and responsibility of patron privacy and confidentiality when interacting in research data services, particularly around consultations. And so we thought it would be really helpful to engage with the fact that when researchers use research data services at an institution like Utah State University, they become library patrons, and the library should afford them all of the protections for patron privacy that we would afford any other library patron. And librarians really need to understand that to become ethical partners in research, academic and research libraries must abide by these disciplinary norms for confidentiality, for the handling of funding applications, for the handling of in-process publications, and for the handling of in-process documentation and research products. And those were just basic requirements in order to establish trust for the researchers. So that was my presentation. I don't have an idea of time. How are we doing on time?
You're good on time. We've got a few minutes, and we're going to save questions, please, for the attendees. Please remember to add any questions that you might have into the Q&A, and we'll address those at the end. Thank you for your presentation. This is certainly a very important topic, one that I'm sure there will be some discussion around as we go.
And I had a little bit of a scheduling conflict, so I will have to jam out about 5 minutes before the end, but please feel free to send me an email or to message me on Whova if you have questions that I'm not able to address.
Okay, so there we go, and we'll thank you, and we'll move on to our next presentation. Our next presentation is It Takes a Village, how data service professionals built a resource toolkit to address the 2023 NIH data management and sharing policy. Our presenters will be Marla Hertz from the University of Alabama at Birmingham, Reed Otsuchi, the University of California, San Diego, and Lucy Carr-Jones from the University of Virginia. Go ahead.
Okay, hi everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity today to talk about a new resource toolkit, which was prepared to address the NIH data management and sharing policy. I'm Marla from UAB, and Lucy is joining me here from UVA, and unfortunately Reed sends his regrets and won't be here today, but he did help us put together this proposal and presentation, and so you can address any questions to all of us. And on top of that, I'm really speaking on behalf of a large working group that collaborated together to develop resources to address the NIH data sharing policy. So here's a brief roadmap for today's talk. I'm going to give an introduction to the NIH data management and sharing policy. I know many of you are well versed in it, so I'm mostly going to spend some time highlighting where the gaps are in guidance to bring this policy to action. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how our working group got its start, and then turn it over to Lucy to describe some of the toolkit resources. And finally, given that the theme for this year's RDAP is centered on communities in data creation and access, we wanted to focus on how our large working group worked together and was successful with a discussion of the technologies that we used in order to stay organized and to stay on task. So again, I assume you're all familiar with this policy, but for those of you who need a refresher, the NIH data management and sharing policy went into effect this January. It applies to all grant proposals that generate scientific data, and it has two main requirements. One is the submission of a 2-page data management and sharing plan. We'll talk about this here, refer to it as the DMS plan. And then the second requirement is documentation of compliance with said plan in annual progress reports. And so, NIH has updated their policy to be consistent with the global cultural change towards open science and open data. It's a much needed update to a 20-year-old policy. And what has happened is kind of explained here in this table. This is just a summary of some of the differences between the old and new policy. And the new policy overall is broader in scope, both in terms of what grants are affected and also in terms of how much data should be shared. They also push for the use of established data repositories, which is counter to the conventional mode of sharing upon request or via a personal website or in the supplementary materials of a publication. And then finally, the policy stipulates that there's these 6 key elements, and so it's really expecting a greater level of detail in the plan. So this change overall means that a lot more researchers are going to be submitting a data management and sharing plan for the first time and navigating data repositories for the first time. And so this is where the library and data service professionals can step in to fill this gap. And as you'll see throughout our talk, our working group really focused in on 2 main goals. One is to develop tools to help researchers write a plan, and 2 is to help our fellow librarians and data service professionals roll out the policy at their institution. So how did this all get started? So in late spring of 2022, the working group was initiated by really from a call to action from Hao Yi at the University of Florida. And it built up through this grassroots collaborative effort to develop a toolkit serving both researchers and especially the data service professionals that help those researchers. And then in June of 2022, we really started up the project in earnest. We met weekly via Zoom, and we came up with a short list of resources to develop and then split into subgroups to create those resources. And the fact that we use this virtual format made it really easy for folks across the US to contribute and allowed for the value of multiple perspectives in terms of what types of resources we should be developing and what those resources should include. And hopefully that led to a more universally useful product. So here, this is a map showing the location of the over 30 data service professionals who had a hand in designing and revising the toolkit. And this really indicates where we all hail from. The larger green circles represent multiple individuals from that location. And here is a full list of all the contributors. This product could not have been done without all of their help and their contributions. This is shown in alphabetical order. And Lucy's going to show you later how you can get in touch with the working group as a whole if you have suggestions or questions about any of the resources within the toolkit. So before we dig into all the products in the toolkit, I wanted to say that, in the months before the policy went into effect, researchers and really especially the research support services are hungry for additional resources to help put this sort of policy, abstract policy into real practice. And so our working group developed this toolkit. It has various resources tailored either to serve researchers or data service professionals or both. The toolkit itself, it can be found on the OSF repository, Open Science Framework. The link is here and peppered throughout the talk, and as well as it was put into the communal notes. So I'm going to turn it over to Lucy to talk about some of the tools in our kit.
All right, thank you, Marla. The first product I'm going to talk about is the Policy Readiness Checklist for librarians. This was designed to help librarians assess the data management support landscape at their institutions, whether they're experienced in data management or new to the field or primarily working in other areas, such as subject liaisons, research and instruction librarians, or solo librarians. Because this policy was so impactful, we really wanted to make sure that people who were at institutions, smaller institutions without a background in this area had the resources they needed. So this particular document includes 4 components: an environmental scan document, a list of potential campus partners, such as Office of Research or the Technology Transfer Office, a list of possible data service areas that the library might be able to provide, and a list of resources such as examples of LibGuides on the policy. Next slide, please. The second product is the DMSP checklist for researchers and the extended reference guide. The first is a short 2-page checklist that was intended to be used by someone writing or reviewing a plan, and it gives a list of information that should be included in each of the plan elements. The subgroup that created it went on to write a 13-page extended reference guide for all the information that did not fit into the short one. And this gives a lot of additional detailed information and links, areas such as data standards and where to look for them, data de-identification techniques, and considerations for selecting a repository. These documents could either be used by a researcher, as indicated in the title, or a librarian or research support staff who's providing training or review services. The third set of products were the sample example plans website and the example DMSP documentation. So the group working on this searched for publicly available data management plans for various funders that were posted in the last 10 years. And from that, they created a spreadsheet and then an online searchable directory of the results. Additionally, an example DMSP was created based on the resource sharing plan. So that would be the 2003 standard from a recently funded R21 grant that included multiple different kinds of data streams, including human subjects, records, and proteomics. And this example plan was then annotated so that someone could see how the new DMS requirements compared to the old resource sharing format. And the fourth product was actually a set of 3 glossaries. So the first was Grant Speak in Context, which is a short guide to the NIH grant seeking process listed by each stage of the process. The grant glossary is a more comprehensive document intended for librarians who might not be familiar with the NIH application process and the whole grant landscape. Finally, the document of data terms relating to the policy defines terms relating to each of the 6 elements in that order. Finally, a forthcoming repository finder website is currently in production, and we hope that will be released shortly. So in this last section, I want to talk about what technology we use to create and disseminate the resources. With such a large distributed group, as you can imagine, this was a really important component in the way we were able to create all of these different products. And this took place over about 6 months of last year. So different people were kind of coming in and out as their job duties, pulled them in other directions. So we needed a central place to store all the documents and make sure everyone had access as needed. So we started out with one Google Doc for meeting notes, which I think it must be 200 pages long by this point. That became about 50 different documents, images, and spreadsheets in a shared Google Drive. And after the majority of the products were released in December of last year, there were discussions about how we wanted to handle communication and moving forward. 2 Google groups were created, one for within group communication amongst ourselves, and another one for outside individuals to contact the group. And we had the option of opting into either of both of those, depending on whether we wanted to continue to be involved. We chose Open Science Framework to host the resources we created, and we've used many of its different features. A couple of them are the ability to add new documents and replace files with updated versions as we've made changes. We also use the OSF Wiki to share a README about the intended uses of the documents, the contributors, and the license we chose. Finally, we did share documents on OSF privately as well for the use of other group members. Most of the project outputs were text documents, which we decided to share as Word files rather than PDFs, because we wanted people to be able to download them and adapt them and edit them and put institutional branding on them and anything else they might want to do. However, we did need a couple of different websites. For example, the example plan finder, we wanted that to be searchable and more easily navigable than a spreadsheet. And we didn't want it to be hosted by any of our institutions, both because of the bureaucracy of kind of getting that approved, and also because if that person then left the institution, it may not be accessible anymore. So we chose GitHub Pages to do this, both because of its alignment with the group's open principles and because we had a group member who was already experienced in it and could stand up the site pretty quickly. One drawback of that was that the site is static, so it doesn't automatically update when the underlying spreadsheet data is updated. However, How, our resident GitHub expert, was able to create a script so that when the spreadsheet is updated, the site can be rebuilt with a single click. Finally, group members expressed an interest in collecting analytics on visits to the OSF. Because of some drawbacks of the OSF analytics page, we're now compiling and storing that on GitHub as well. I wanted to end with a final note about the project's format. The need for an open license was actually discussed in the very first meeting of the group, and the Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike license was ultimately chosen. Because different members worked on different parts of these projects or these products, we created a citation for each product so that the names of its particular contributors could be referenced as they desired. And finally, a group style guide was created to make sure both that the documents had a uniform appearance and titling and things like that, and also that accessibility guidelines were followed. Thank you so much for joining us today. There's a link in our slide deck to the OSF as well as the aforementioned contact email if you want to send an email to our whole group. And you're also welcome to, of course, contact us individually.
Great. Thank you for your presentation. And if you look at the chat, you'll see a lot of love for your toolkit. Thank you to all of the folks who worked on that. On a personal note, I also want to thank you. It was an incredibly useful toolkit as we were preparing for our own institutional R01 grant submissions. So thank you very much. And a reminder to everybody, please put your questions in the Q&A. We'll address them at the end. We're going to do our move into our lightning talks now. I'm going to introduce both of our lightning talks up front because they run back to back. So our first lightning talk is guiding from the middle, navigating hierarchies while formalizing research data management services. And the presenters for that are going to be Janet Rothney and Jordan Bass, both from the University of Manitoba. And our second presentation, our second lightning talk will be creating and refining data management planning services for a diverse scientific research community. And that will be presented by Aaron Antonioli, who's at the USDA National Agricultural Library.
Welcome to the session, Guiding from the Middle. I'm Janet Rothney, RDM librarian at the University of Manitoba, and my co-presenter is Jordan Bass, coordinator of research services and digital strategies. So in March of 2021, Canada's federal granting agencies, CIHR, NSERC, and SSHRC, launched the Tri-Agency Research Data Management Policy. The policy includes 3 pillars: implementing DMP requirements for funding applications, requiring institutional strategy documentation from all organizations that administer tri-agency funding, and a future requirement for data deposit. Most of the discussion today revolves around the process of developing the strategy for our institution, the University of Manitoba.
Both Janet and I are in-scope academic employees within the University of Manitoba libraries. We both engaged with RDM at our institution around 2015 and were in very unrelated positions at the time. However, being involved from the beginning of RDM at our institution has positioned us as those two who know about RDM. That being said, we're only 2 people in a complex and large institution, and working within this system, even with a common goal in mind, can at times be tedious. We have been working with an institutional RDM committee whose membership consists of representation from a number of academic and research service departments. And those service departments are reflected here with the green dots. Janet and I have been working with this RDM committee since early 2021 and have achieved a number of important milestones to date. While our most recent milestone was publishing the university's RDM strategy, the work the committee put in to get here was substantial. This slide seeks to illustrate a number of the activities we engage with in supporting RDM. The red line demarks what we consider as the 2 spheres of work across 2 broad demographics or audiences. The items above the red line represent the work we do for the RDM committee and for senior level university administration. And this work is largely invisible to our immediate librarian colleagues. The items below the red line represent our more public-facing work, which is correspondingly more perceptible to library staff. This work has a very large and diverse audience in the sense that it involves colleagues from multiple units directly working with us. This sphere of work also sees us engaging with multiple researchers on the ground. All to say, the work we do below that red line is what most people see and is likely what most have come to understand as the library's role in RDM. The work we do above that line is somewhat atypical in that we, as in-scope library employees, are directly contributing to institution-wide decision-making about RDM. We highlight these distinctions not to complain about workload or to garner any kind of sympathy, but rather to reveal that we, again, as libraries employees, are at the vanguard of 2 important but also very separate theaters of RDM at our university. Some of the challenges we have encountered in this process are as follows: convincing senior administrators that we know what we're talking about when it comes to RDM, building productive professional relationships with colleagues across multiple units. National funding/directives for RDM are not entirely clear at this stage of the game. Advising senior administrative bodies, reaching consensus on an unwieldy number of RDM issues, liaising with other institutions and organizations across Canada, and setting a work roadmap for colleagues both within and external to the libraries, all the while not holding any genuine decision-making power as university employees. Some of the RDM impacts and realities for libraries are also as follows. Libraries will continue to be involved both vertically and horizontally within the institution's hierarchy. It is expected that the majority of RDM outreach, education, and services will be provided by the libraries. Working groups established to address institutional RDM challenges will inherently involve library employees. On-the-ground RDM support provided by libraries' employees is dependent on the outcomes of those RDM working groups. Maintaining momentum after publishing the university's RDM strategy may be difficult. And of course, unknowns in budget and staffing, as well as competing institutional priorities, are expected, but difficult to plan for.
Outside of libraries, there are a few big themes that we see coming out of our RDM implementation. So first, transparency, collaboration, and leadership is needed across many disparate units. This requires a major cultural shift, or we risk continuing to be siloed. We believe that better cohesion equals better research processes for everyone. This requires a shared understanding of goals and directions, or we risk continuing to work with inefficient and sometimes contradictory processes and policies. And lastly, the focus of this work regularly shifts between big picture planning and service support at the research level, and will likely do so for some time as RDM norms develop locally and in Canada. This requires service providers and the research community to remain flexible and adaptable during this phase of change, or we risk making decisions too quickly, too slowly, or having external forces drive the agenda without us. We welcome any questions, comments, or feedback and look forward to hearing about your experiences with RDM service development. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Antonoli with the USDA National Agricultural Library, and I'm here to talk about some of the library's initiatives in creating and refining data management planning services for a diverse scientific research community. The USDA Agricultural Research Service, or ARS, requires a data management plan as part of the larger project plan for all research projects. The DMP follows a rigid 6-section format, but researchers encounter challenges understanding and complying with the various policies, procedures, and best practices outlined for data management. Difficulty results partly from the sheer diversity of research areas covered by USDA. Each research community presents unique challenges that a lean data management staff struggles to meet. The National Agricultural Library already offers general data management services to help researchers navigate the data management planning process. But these resources are not specific enough to help with the finer points of creating a subject-specific DMP. A University of Maryland College Park Digital Curation iSchool Fellow is working with the data management team this year. We decided to focus her project on the repositories our researchers use because this decision of where to store research data impacts the entire data lifecycle. Between the expected data types and file formats, metadata standards, public access, and preservation, all these data management lifecycle stages relate in some way to the repository choice a researcher makes. If we know the repository a researcher plans to use, we can better prepare, advise, and provide support to researchers as they complete their DMPs. Our team brainstormed ways to hone data management resources and workflows for select research areas. After some initial information gathering, we decided to go directly to the USDA researchers to ask what repositories they currently use, their research subject areas, and whether they need help choosing a repository. In our initial group of 300 survey recipients, we received over 100 responses within a week, and to date, received just under a 50% return. The response rate blew away our expectations and reinforced the need for this targeted service. Our survey uncovered some key baselines to build from. While many researchers knew where they wanted to deposit their data, they weren't sure how the updated USDA policies and federal guidelines affected their choices. And many listed specific data destinations that fell short of meeting these requirements. Over half of respondents had never deposited data into a repository before and needed guidance in evaluating and choosing a repository. And both groups wanted to know how repository information should be accounted for in their DMPs. We'll use this information to identify opportunities for targeted resources and training based on specific repositories and subject areas. In the works are repository evaluations and checklists to help guide researchers toward the best storage and access solutions, and will develop DMP templates based on repository features to help the researchers in the next review cycle. We expect the process to be iterative, and will work with the researchers early on to refine these resources so we can build up a self-serve library of more subject-specific offerings. We'll use the lessons learned to refine our data management services to more effectively help wider areas of our research community. Included here is a link to NAL data management services and resources. My contact information is repeated here as well, and I wanted to give a shout out to my wonderful collaborators, Siobhan Hedgepeth, Dr. Sarah Duke, and Allison Reifus. Thank you for your time today, and I look forward to talking more with all of you about data management.
If anybody else has any questions, you can throw them in the chat. There's a lot of, or in the Q&A, there's a lot of really great conversation going on in the chat, but we are getting close to the end of the session. So if there's nothing else, I'm sure we can continue this conversation separately and together at different other presentations, other sessions. I want to thank all of our presenters and the audience for participating in this session. And we'll see you at our next presentations, which will start tomorrow. This is the end for the day, but we do have one more social event this afternoon. That is going to start in 10 minutes, a little bit more than 10 minutes at 4:10. That'll be a separate Zoom link that you can get from the Whova platform. So join us there. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow when we start our sessions again. Our opening social Kickstarter for tomorrow is at 11 a.m. And poster sessions will start at noon. Thank you all for joining us.